Okay, guys, good morning. Let's get started. So today we're going to wrap up our little chat about plants, and then we're going to talk about how um, animals have evolved, the major classes of animals, things like that, all the sort of major milestones, sort of the way we did things with plants here. So just as a reminder, and I sent this email out yesterday, remember we won't have any in-person classes next Monday or Tuesday, but we will have a lecture available for you on Blackboard. But as always, if you have any questions, feel free to say them or drop a question in the group chat. Let's get started. So where we left off yesterday, we were talking about conifers. We were talking about our gymnosperms. So these organisms are vascular plants. And just as a reminder as to what our gymnosperms look like, this is what they look like. You most commonly know them here from Massachusetts as our oh so lovely pines. And maybe if you're from California, you know them as redwoods or sequoias. So this is what we're talking about. These types of plants, remember, they are vascular plants, meaning they have essentially a circulatory-like system that relies on the cohesion and adhesion of water to move things up great distances. Now remember, these plants can be some of the oldest and tallest plants on the planet, and so they have some really great adaptations. In particular, their seed, they're the first organisms to evolve seed. So remember, seed is this fertilized egg. It's this nice protective coating around what's called an endosperm, which is a nice, very nutrient-rich piece of material that allows these plants to essentially land in a spot, immediately start growing, and have all the nutrients it needs to essentially make it to a very small-sized plant. So very huge evolutionary milestone along the way for plant evolution. And remember, seeds take this really wide diversity of things, ranging from something as simple as, like a bean seed, or something as simple as, a seed from any garden variety plant you would find, or something as cool as like a pomegranate seed. So seeds take a wide variety of things, shapes, colors, textures, as you can see. And remember, our conifers and our gymnosperms have cones. And remember, cones can be male or female cones. With the female cones being receptive to the pollen that the male cones release in. Remember, pollen is this new technique that these organisms have put forth. They're releasing pollen into the air that then goes and fertilizes another tree. So remember, these trees can't fertilize themselves. They have to physically fertilize another tree. And this is in contrast to the previous two groups of plants we talked about, the non-vascular plants, which include mosses, and our vascular but non-seeded plants, which include things like ferns, which are reliant on water to essentially distribute their spores as opposed to the pollen. So very, very different life cycles. And but next up, we're going to talk about the most evolved group of plants, and this group of plants is called the angiosperms, or the flowering plants. And what's so special about the angiosperms, and what we sort of typically think about when we think about most plants, is they've developed flowers. And flowers are a really unique structure that plants have evolved. It's relatively new speaking, like it evolved about the time of the dinosaurs, in that ballpark. And the flowers have a very sort of conserved structure overall between flowers. Now, they might look vastly different. So you can look at something like this that would look very much like a rose flower. But that's in contrast to something like a sunflower, right? I'm sure you've all seen sunflowers. They look very, very different, but they have the same overall conserved structure. Remember, this is something that evolved very early on in the sort of this line of angiosperms, and that has just been tweaked by different groups of plants. So this is a structure that is conserved. It is homologous between all these different groups of angiosperms, but there has been some evolution that's happened depending on the needs of the organism. And so one of the things about flowers is they have both male and female parts. So they have the stamen here, which includes the anther and the filament. This is the male reproductive structure. This is what produces the pollen. And then they have the carpel, which is this long tube here. And at the bottom, you have, at the top, it's capped by the stigma. You have the style, which is this elongated stalk. And then finally, you have the ovary down here at the bottom. And then there's obviously the petal, and then the green parts below the petal are called the sepals. This is the overall basic structure of a flower. We have the stamen, and the carpel. And remember, male parts, female parts. And yes, all flowers do contain both the male and the female parts. And you'll see why that is right now, because the idea being is angiosperms, they rely solely on pollination by different organisms. So whereas our gymnosperms relied on the air, our ferns relied on the air, and our non-vascular plants relied on water, our flowering plants, or angiosperms, they don't rely on that at all. What they rely on is physical contact with some sort of pollinator. And a pollinator can be really anything. It can be a bird, it can be a bat, it can be a bee, it could be a beetle, it could be a fly, it could be anything that will essentially go to these flowers and essentially feed upon the flowers and essentially get tagged by pollen. So the idea being is, if we have this picture of this bee right here, it flies over, and what it does is it starts to interact with essentially the carpel as well as other parts within the flower to get some sweet nectar from the flower. So the idea being is these flowers have bright colors. They're trying to attract all these different pollinators, and what they're offering in return is a nice sweet treat. However, as you can see with this bee over here, well, the bee might get a nice sweet treat, but what it's going to happen is it's going to get tagged by these stamen. So the idea being is that when a pollinator lands and starts to drink the nectar of a flower, what's going to end up happening is that the pollen is essentially going to stick to the bee. As you can see here, the bee is essentially covered to it. So that once the bee leaves, once it's done drinking the nectar from here, it's going to fly to another flower, and it's going to bring that brand new pollen over to a new carpel, thus transferring the pollen from one flower to the next. So that's what we're working with here. So all flowers have both male and female parts, but they're designed so that when something comes and feeds on them, whether it could be a bird, it could be a bat, it could be a bee, it could be a fly, it could be a beetle, it could be a moth, it could be a butterfly, it could be any sort of thing. Sometimes even mice will do it, but they get tagged with pollen, and they bring that pollen to another flower when they go to feed on another flower. That being said, some flowers will, if I have a flower on one plant and I go fly it on the same exact plant and I go to a different flower on that plant, you can sometimes have fertilization of the same plant. So like pollen from the plant will fertilize itself. But most commonly the pollen will go essentially to another plant and fertilize that other plant. There's a lot of sort of mixed bag things here in terms of which plants can't be pollinated by their own pollen versus those that can't. But again, the idea is there's this evolved relationship between flower and pollinator. And we talked about one extreme case of this when we talked about evolution. And this was the moth and the orchid on Madagascar that had a 11-inch long proboscis. So this is a very strongly evolved evolution relationship. And there are some plants out there, some angiosperms out there that can only be pollinated by one specific organism. But there are many other angiosperms that can be pollinated by a wide variety of organisms. But the vast majority of pollination on this planet does occur via insects, thinking of bees, thinking of flies, thinking of beetles, thinking of moths, butterflies, things like that. So they do provide a really important service to us overall. So if you ever see an insect, it's better not to kill it because they're generally pretty good. But our angiosperm life cycle, very much like our gymnosperm life cycle, is split between a diploid and a haploid stage, about 50-50. So when you have an adult plant, say we have this orange here, it's in a diploid stage. And when this orange plant decides it wants to flower because it wants to reproduce, most angiosperms will reproduce once a year. Some will produce multiple times a year. It just depends on the angiosperm. But the idea being is once it's getting ready to reproduce, it produces flowers. And it's only producing flowers because it wants to reproduce. It's not producing flowers because it wants to be beautiful, or for us, it just wants to reproduce. Because remember, as we talked about, life really just wants to pass on its genetic material to the next generation. That's what life's all about. And so it has this diploid stage, and it starts to produce flowers. And once it produces flowers and the flowers open, and pollinators start to come, you rely on pollinators, bees, insects, again, all the things we've talked about, to bring pollen to a new ovary, so that, oh boy, I'm forgetting my own terminology here, a new carpel here, and essentially bringing that pollen, because remember, pollen is haploid. Ovaries, before they are fertilized, they're haploid. And so once this pollen gets brought here and eventually the ovary gets fertilized, it then becomes a diploid. And once that ovary gets fertilized, it then becomes a seed of some sort. Now, when you're thinking about seeds, we're thinking about really anything, right? You know, when we were talking about, just to go back, when we were talking about conifers here in gymnosperms, right, their seeds were like nuts, right? Well, seeds are, as I mentioned, are really, really diverse. So when we think about sort of one of the things that angiosperms have done relative to, say, a conifer, which just has seeds it releases, angiosperms have developed a package to package their things in. And I hope by seeing this orange over here, you realize that that package is typically a fruit. And so what angiosperms have developed, in it, which makes them really unique and makes them an important agricultural staple for humans, is this idea of fruit. Now, a fruit, all it is in this micro show, it might not, it varies depending on year to year. Some people are really grossed out by this fact, but when we think about what a fruit is, all it really is just a fertilized egg. That's all a fruit is. It's just a fertilized egg containing seeds that is designed to package these seeds to be picked up by an animal to be spread away from the mother tree, essentially. That's the idea. That's all you're really eating when you eat fruit. You're eating a fertilized egg. And that fertilized egg is just designed to be nice and sweet and tasty, so you can carry that seed away, poop it out somewhere, and that plant can grow in a new spot. And so that's what the angiosperms have brought to the table in terms of seeds. Not just flowers, but in terms of seeds, they put these delicious packaging on there. And so you could think of anything. A tomato is an angiosperm. It produces a fruit, which is just covered in seeds, which is just filled with seeds. Oranges, seeds. Pomegranates, seeds, right? But it's all packaged in a delicious fruit that's nice and sweet, lots of energy for whatever's going to eat it. So there's a high desirability to grab that physical fruit, eat it, and take those seeds somewhere else. So that's another thing the angiosperms have brought to sort of nature, is this tasty fruit. And again, this is something humans have taken advantage of in spades, right? Pretty much every agricultural crop we use is an angiosperm. There are lots of exceptions to that, but the vast majority of them are angiosperms. They're flowering plants. So there's just a sort of a really important aspect of human evolution that has occurred by using angiosperms here as well. But as I mentioned, there's a co-evolutionary fact going along here, where we have our our flowers are from our angiosperms, and it evolves a relationship with their pollinators. And so there's a couple of co-evolutionary factors that we can examine here and think about how did this push on both sides. And so the first thing is colors and patterns. So for instance, white colors attract nocturnal predators because white reflects the most light at night. Conversely, we have bright colors on flowers, which are essentially good for bringing in diurnal or day-feeding organisms. And so evolving a color that is specific to maybe one time of the day or is specific to essentially one type of vision, right? So for instance, birds can see bright colors like reds and yellows really well, but have a very hard time seeing blues and other colors. So there's this evolutionary relationship where you can evolve a color that suits your pollinator, because your pollinator, say, does a really good job at getting your pollen and passing that pollen on to another plant, which then makes reproduction more likely. Remember, that's what we're thinking. Traits that make it more likely to be passed on to the next generation. Next up, we can think about flower structure, and we talked about the moth with the crazy 11-inch long tongue, and so you can change the size of the tube, the dimensions, the length, the width, the depth, and that attracts different types of pollinators because different pollinators are going to have different tongues. So you can imagine this moth here has a very thin and long tongue, whereas this bird has a very short and fat tongue, right? So very different structures that will prevent something like this from pollinating this and vice versa. In addition, depending on how how intricate or how closed or open it is, it benefits different types of pollinators. So big pollinators like birds and bats, they don't like small, intricate, closed things, but small pollinators like bees and flies have no problem going in here, picking these apart to get the nectar and eventually get the pollen as well. But that's the idea. You can change your structure to only essentially select for certain pollinators to come and get the pollen. Next up is odors. There's all sorts of odors out there that plants have developed to attract things. So there's sweet odors, there's stinky odors, and they attract different groups of organisms. So very stinky flowers, which they're really gross, but it is what it is, like to attract things that look for rotting meat. Um, so principally flies and wasps will come pollinate these ones. Very sweet smells attract butterflies and bees and moths. Um, Flowers that typically have no odors will attract only big things like bats and birds. So, and then finally, nectar. Lots of nectar is the primary reason most things come to a flower. And again, nectar is just a very sugary substance. That's basically, it's just a giant pile of sugar. And it's basically designed to bring in things for a nice, tasty treat. There are some flowers that don't have nectar. Again, they can be very specific. So like maybe in the case we talked about the moth, there's only one pollinator for this flower, or you can have a flower that has many, many pollinators. It just depends on what the flower has done in terms of its evolutionary trajectory. Um, and so once you have seeds, you do a couple, our angiosperms do a couple different things. So we talked about fruits. Angiosperms did evolve fruits, that delicious, tasty thing. You see this donkey eating these apples, and I understand that. It's one of my favorite fruits. And you see this donkey's eating this apple because the flower is essentially matured into a delicious fruit that allows something to eat it and take the seeds somewhere else. Because remember, we're talking about seeds here. So, right, it's an egg, it's fertilized, but it's holding seeds. So that's one method, and that's the sort of the newest way. Another very sort of common way we see with seeds is flying or floating away. And you all have seen dandelions before. Dandelions, when they're flower, they're attracting pollinators. Once they get pollinated, they turn into these white fluff balls. And I'm sure you guys, at some point in your life, have probably kicked one or picked one up and blown the little petals away, because that's just fun. And but these little white things are the seeds, and they're reliant on flying and floating. That flying is typically from natural gusts of air, but you can imagine as a kid, if you were blowing one of these, that's an artificial thing, and you're helping disperse the seeds. So we've seen that already with our ferns and stuff like that. So that's not particularly very new, but again, it's a seed flying away. And it's actually kind of cool. There's lots of different structures of seeds that have taken, like, I'm sure you guys have seen like the ones on the campus that are like pinwheels. They essentially spin as they fly through the air. And there's all sorts of cool structures that seeds have taken in the angiosperms. And then finally, again, really a new way for angiosperms is essentially hitching a ride. And I love this picture because the dog's face is just priceless. But you can essentially, as an angiosperm, if you produce something that's sticky, you can hitch a ride. And so there's special types of angiosperms that produce these little packets of seeds that are sticky. And there's all different variations on this, but they essentially stick to the coat of whatever happened to walk into them, and they get brought somewhere else just by being sticky. And these are awful. Anything that does this is awful because they're really stabby. And so this is a really effective way of getting an animal to take your things away without providing a tasty treat like they do with fruits and stuff like that. So. Sort of just to wrap up what we're talking about with plants today. Across all lineages of plants, plants have developed numerous techniques to defend themselves. Small. Now, at the microbial level, there's all sorts of plant immune responses out there. So plants have their own immune system, very much like we do. It's very, very effective at killing bacterial pathogens. So at the microscopic level, there is to defend themselves is actually caffeine. And so caffeine was evolved to essentially ward off insect predators. It's pretty toxic to most insects. And if we ate enough caffeine in one day, it would kill us as well. But the idea being is they evolved this chemical to ward off predators. So they take a bite of it, they get this nasty chemical like caffeine, and they leave. The idea you can deter something from eating on you by having something that's chemical in you. Another great example of this is peppers. So peppers have capsaicin in them, which is a pretty nasty chemical. We see it as hot to our tongue, right? Very sort of kind of burns. But most things, if they ate that, would actually it would hurt them a lot, and they would stop eating it. They're not like humans where we'll eat 24 buffalo wings slathered in super hot sauce, which is made from peppers, and keep on eating it because it tastes good. Most things will bite a pepper and they'll run away because it's too hot for them. In addition, I will also mention that capsaicin has been shown to be antibacterial. So in addition to warding off predators, it's been known to ward off infections. That being said, don't put peppers on a cut or something like that. I feel like I don't need to say that, but I just figured I'd say it. In addition, there's also they've evolved sticky traps, and so they exude some sticky substances that can essentially, if you have an insect chewing on you, will essentially engulf and smother that insect that's chewing on you. In addition, they've also developed anatomical structures, and so we have spiky things. So you guys can think of the cactus. They have spiky structures and spines that prevent things from directly biting on them without physically getting hurt. In addition, some plants have evolved, in particular the acacia plants, that have evolved specialized structures on them that essentially house ants. And so they have their own little army of bodyguards. So the ants live on and inside the trees, and they protect the trees from predators, while the tree provides them with housing and some food and stuff like that as well. So there's all sorts of cool stuff, and this is a really interesting evolutionary relationship. And if I'm not mistaken, this is a really cool video on that sort of evolutionary relationship between ants and acacia trees. But again, all this is our angiosperms, and these are flowering plants. Bushes, it's basically anything you think of: apple trees, bushes, herbs, tulips, grapes, anything you think of. And so that's our angiosperms. And so that's going to wrap up our talk about plants. So we talked about the angiosperms today. Most advanced group of plants, flowering, important for human agriculture, evolution. They have flowers, they have fruits. They have new invented ways to package seeds. And again, angiosperms are most of the things that we think about when we think about a plant. We talked about the conifers and the gymnosperms last class. Again, they're non-flowering, but they're vascular and they produce seeds. This is probably the most important landmark in terms of plant evolution, the evolution of seeds. Again, seeds being a really important thing, both for humans as well as for nature as well. And then we have our non-vascular plants and our vascular non-seeded plants, which are the mostly old lineages of plants, very low to the ground, relying on water and relying on overall more primitive methods to distribute their essentially their offspring to the next generation. And so remember, our plants, they did descend from something in the water that allowed them to sort of colonize land. But remember, early land plants were teeny tiny because gravity and drying out was a really big deal. And our modern lineages of plants have really overcome that in recent years. So, but with that, let's transition. This is a perfect transition, obviously, because we're going from talking about plants to talking about animals. But that's our next topic, is going to talk about animal diversification. And our title slide for this animal diversification is my dog, Snickers. So you can enjoy how cute she looks in this picture. But we're really talking about how animals came to be. What are some of the major milestones about animal evolution? How did they diversify? And what sort of struggles they had moving from sea to land. So at this point, we've talked about all this part. This is our microbial talk, origin of life. We talked about how we got multicellular life in the last class, and we'll do a quick review on that, how we got organelles, and then we talked about the land plants here. But we really we're going to start talking about some of these early parts, what happened in the early, what sorts of organisms who are early in the ocean. The jellyfish are very early sponges, things like that. And then we'll talk about sort of how we radiated up this tree or up this sort of group of things. And then likely next class we'll talk about sort of how primates evolved and things like that. So because we're going to spend next class talking about heredity. So but just as a reminder, we got our nucleus, we got our all of our organelles by an endosymbiosis event. That's the best line of evidence we have thus far. Endosymbiosis of organelles, of bacteria inside of a larger cell led to specialized functions, and those specialized functions came to be things like endoplasmic reticulum, nuclei, mitochondria, things like that. So this is the sort of the flow, the engulfment of something that resembles a mitochondria by a larger cell. So that's the flow, the endosymbiotic theory, and we talked about all the evidence for that last class. So if you need a refresher on that, it's like halfway through the talk or something like that yesterday. So, but again, back to our tree of life. We talked about the prokaryotes, the bacteria, the archaea, because they're the first life on the planet. And then at some point there was the last universal common ancestor that branched off, and eventually it led us down this path of the eukaryotes. Again, remember the organisms that are larger, that have membrane-bound organelles. And we didn't really talk about any of these other groups like ciliates and stuff like that, because the world of what are called protists or single-celled eukaryotes is kind of a mess. So we don't really talk about that in a basic biology course. But we did talk about a little bit about algae and plants, and we talked about fungi. And today we're going to move on and talk about the animals and what sort of constitutes an animal. What are some of the major traits and the major groups of our animals? And so we talked about, again, we started off here in the Archean eon, how life was formed, early microbial life. Then we talked about how eukaryotes came to be. We talked about early land plants, and and today we're really sort of jumping headfirst into this sort of what's called the Paleozoic area, where you start to see, again, in more modern time, about a half a billion years back in time, we're going to talk about today. We're thinking about how jellies and how arthropods and how all this stuff came to be. So, but what you will notice on this sort of timeline as well is that you're seeing like animals were coming about a very sort of a similar time as land plants were coming about too. And you start to seeing the diversification of land plants at a time where things were diversifying in terms of fish and insects on land, and insects and other organisms on land. So the evolution of plants and animals on land, as well as animals in the sea and plants in the sea, were parallel. They weren't just sort of happening in isolation, right? The diversification of plants was being pushed by different groups of insects and things like that. So everything is sort of happening in parallel, but we sort of had to break it up into different chunks. But most of what we're going to talk about today is going to be in this Paleozoic era, a much more modern time in evolutionary history. And again, 500 million years might not seem like a modern time, but again, starting at 4.6 billion years ago, it's much more modern than it is ancient. So the broadly question we'll ask is, what is an animal? What constitutes an animal? And there are essentially three broad categories that we could say that all animals share in common. First is that they are multicellular. You cannot be an animal without being multicellular. There are no animals that are not multicellular. You have to have more than one cell. Principally, you need to have potentially thousands of cells to be an animal. But even the tiniest animals, microscopic ones, still have more than one cell. So that's first. Second is animals need to move, at least not all the time like we would see here with, say, like an antelope or something like that. At some point in your life, you have to be able to move. So every animal has to be able to move, and that could be just, say, during a like a larval stage or something like that. But at some point in your life, if you're going to be what's classified as an animal, you physically have to be able to move. And then finally, you have to be heterotrophic. You need to eat other organisms, and you can be an animal you eat plants, so you're a herbivore, or you can eat plants and animals, so you're an omnivore, or eat only animals, which would make you a carnivore. So you have to sort of fall under these three broad classifications. Now, interestingly enough, these are all sort of consistent with animals, but there are a few plants that essentially follow this structure as well. So I'm thinking about the pitcher plants. So I don't know if you guys have heard of a pitcher plant before. They're carnivorous plants, or maybe a Venus flytrap. they sort of encompass these three categories as well. But um, that being said, this is a very broad definition of an animal, because as you'll see, animals encompass a very large portion of things that are larger than single cells. So, but again, you you can again classify animals, certain plants as animals if you so chose. But again, animals, we're thinking about multicellularity and being strictly heterotrophic. So animals, they're divided into multiple different groups. Many of these you have probably heard of. I'd be surprised if you hadn't heard of all these at some point. Maybe the worms, or you haven't heard of, but sort of the broad categories of animals that we're going to talk about today. We have the deuterosomes. So essentially, the first opening to form in development becomes the animal's mouth. So whatever opens in you first becomes your mouth. It's a weird way to think about it, but that's okay. That's in contrast to the protozomes, where the first opening inside you as you're developing becomes your anus. Again, weird thing to think about, but it is what it is. And then we have our cnidarians and our sponges, which have radiation symmetrically, and then our sponges, which have no tissues or organs. So these are the sort of the four big groups. And within those four big groups, there are multiple subgroups, as you can see here. And we're going to talk about all these, some in more depth than others, because certain groups like the arthropods are super duper important for this planet, whereas other groups like the nectoderms or the the flatworms, not particularly that important. But so we're going to spend time on talking about the important ones, but we're going to touch base on sort of all of these as well. But what you'll notice is that we all share some sort of ancestral protist, which again is a microscopic eukaryote. And this microscopic eukaryote would have been heterotrophic. It would have been single cellular until it evolved the capacity to be multicellular. So just as a note. And so one of the big things that that sort of distinguishes between these different groups of organisms is this idea of direct versus indirect development. And so when you have essentially lots of nourishing yolk inside your egg, embryos will develop into a miniature adult. The idea being is that you have this direct development. So when you have lots of yolk inside your egg, you develop into a smaller version of an adult. So that would be like a bird, right? A bird inside the egg has lots of nourishing material. It develops directly into a smaller version of its adult. So that's direct development. When there's very little yolk present, the young develop into a larval stage that can then feed. This is what we call indirect development. And so that's the sort of one of the big distinctions. Are you a mini adult when you were born, like very much like most of the mammals, birds, reptiles, things like that? Or you have indirect development, like an amphibian, where you're a larval stage and you have to develop after you've left your egg. That being said, there's one sort of final group, and that's our mammals, which have very little yolk. So I'm sure you guys all know what yolk is from eating eggs at some point in your life, but you have very little yolk as a mammal, but you nourish your embryo via the placenta. So humans, we come out as baby adults, but we had almost no yolk inside of essentially our egg capacity, like inside the placenta itself, but we are being nourished by essentially our mothers as we developed. And so when we're thinking about our larger groups, this idea of direct versus indirect development is important, but there are four sort of key distinctions we can think about between our animals. And so the first is, does it have tissue or not? Remember, tissue is a special group of cells that are behaving in a similar manner. So tissue, you can think of muscle tissue, right? Your muscle tissue is behaving and acting together, doing a similar function. You can either have radial or bilateral symmetry, and I'll go through that in a second. You can have that protosome or deuterosome development. Again, which opening that happens first becomes your butt and which becomes your mouth. And then the idea being, do you grow through molting or not? And so tissues, do they have specialized tissues? So when we think about a human, we have specialized tissues, right? We have connective tissues, we have skin tissue, we have nervous tissue, we have muscle tissue, right? Is there specialized tissue? And again, specialized tissues does one specific function, right? Your muscles tissue does not detoxify your body, right? That's your liver tissue. But muscle tissue does one very special function. Next up is development. radial or bilateral. And so the idea being, are you shaped like a pie, or do you have a left and right side? So if you're shaped like a pie, that means you're the same on all sides. So you can think about a bucket here, or I guess a flower pot, right? It's the same on all sides, right? There's no left or right side. And that's the same thing we see here with the sponge, right? It's the same all the way around. And that's in contrast to something that has a left and right side, like a lobster, because you can see a lobster has bilateral, meaning on both sides, right down the middle, symmetry, meaning it's left side, and there's a left side and a right side, but there is symmetry between that as well. You can see that with the lobster, you can see it with the shovel, and you can see that with yourself. You have bilateral symmetry when you take a peek at yourself in the mirror. Next up is how you develop. And so, do you develop front to back? Do you have a back to front or a front to back digestive system? How are you developing? Do you start off as a miniature version of adult, and you grow into a larger adult, or do you start as a larva? You have to land somewhere and develop as you leave the womb. And then finally, how do you grow? Do you grow by molting, or do you grow by adding to the skeleton? And so the idea being is, if you think about how a spider grows, it's at one point in its life, or multiple points in its life, it grows by simply shedding its ectoskeleton, getting larger in the process. Whereas opposed to humans, we add onto the same skeleton, build that skeleton up over and over again. So very different groups of development we're talking about here. And so we're going to start with the most simple, and we're going to start with arguably the most important group of animals, and these are our invertebrates. And our invertebrates are broadly classified as anything without a spine. And these organisms are held up either by a tough outer exoskeleton, like you see here in this leaf bug, or they're held up because they live in water. And so the sort of the forces of water hold them up, keep them intact. And invertebrates, as you'll notice, make up essentially all of the tree of life. There are, as we know of right now, it depends on who you ask, but it can vary between, 50,000 to like 100,000 species of animals with spines. So they'd be called the chordates. So there's a lot of them, but in contrast to this group of animals, there are millions. There are millions of species of invertebrates out there. And again, to put this in more perspective as to how successful invertebrates are, there are more species of just butterflies out there than there are species of mammals or anything with a spine. So invertebrates are incredibly successful groups of organisms, and we're going to talk about what sort of adaptations, what sort of life cycles they have to allow them to be very successful. Now, we think about animals, we think about, cool things like monkeys and lizards and snakes and all sorts of cool things like elephants, but those things are big and they require a lot of energy. But our arthropods and our invertebrates, they're not so complex. They have much more simple. And as we saw with the bacteria, which again are the most abundant organisms on the planet, which account for 60% of the biomass on the planet, you don't need to be crazy complex to be successful. You don't need to be crazy complex to have a great effect on the planet as a whole. And so that's what we're going to start talking about, the invertebrates. We're going to talk about the most important group of guys out there. So we're going to start with the most basic, the most simple, the earliest evolutionary tract in the animals, and this is our sponges. And so as you can see from these pictures, sponges, they're not particularly very exciting. They're just tubes, and that's really all they are. They're tubes that live inside the ocean. That's it. It's really not a very exciting group to talk about, unfortunately, but they're just tubes. And that's all they are. Very, very simple. They're multicellular. They don't have tissue. They are not motile once they are adults. But they are the very first thing that evolved in terms of multicellularity. They were closely followed by jellyfish, I will make note of, but it all started really with the sponges. Now, again, sponges are just hollow tubes. They have no organs or tissues, so they don't have muscle. They don't have things like that. So that's our sponge. That's what they look like. This is just a simplified version of what a sponge looks like. Very, very simple. But sponges reproduce asexually. So they essentially produce these things called, I can't remember, it's like choanocytes that essentially they produce those as their own sort of version of sperm. And essentially they produce an amoebocyte, which essentially allows them to Their egg, they're essentially their version of an egg that they can then be fertilized, and then they essentially eject that out of their big hole here. That's pretty much it. They reproduce asexually, though, so they're fertilizing their own stuff. And as we saw with bacteria, asexual reproduction is a very fast way to reproduce. But as we'll talk about next class and next week, not the best way in terms of genetic diversity to do things, but a very successful way of mating nonetheless. And you can physically see sponges exuding their fertilized sperm and their fertilized eggs and their sperms and stuff. They just, again, this is a sponge. It just spews this stuff up like a volcano straight out into the ocean around it. Again, all asexually reproduce them. But the idea being is if you release some fertilized eggs out here, or you release some sperm and eggs out here to fertilize, what will end up happening is the currents of the ocean will pick it up, and it'll pick it up and bring it somewhere else. And once it picks it up and brings it somewhere else, it can land and then start to develop into a mature sponge and repeat the process over and over again. But you can imagine if you are a sponge and you're releasing thousands upon millions of these eggs and sperms and things like that, that it might be a pretty good way to spread pretty quickly. And in fact, sponges do reproduce very quickly. They can spread very quickly. So a really good sort of adaptation here for the sponges. Next up is our cnidarians, and these are typically we think about them as the jellyfish, but corals also follow under this group of organisms. And now you might be thinking to yourselves, corals don't move. They're reefs. They're basically just rock. And as I mentioned, corals have to be considered an animal, you need to physically be able to move at some point in your life. And corals do move when they are young. So just as a note. But corals and jellyfish are among some of the most beautiful, at least in my opinion, among some of the most beautiful animals out there. They take all sorts of crazy shapes and colors and things like that. So we have our coral reefs, and corals are really interesting. So if you've ever been to a place that has coral reefs, potentially the Caribbean, maybe Hawaii, Australia, people like to think of corals as plants. And again, corals are not plants. They are animals. They rely on eating food. They're not motile when they're adults, but when they're young, they are. And they are animals. So when you go see a coral reef, it's a living, breathing animal. It's not a plant. Don't touch it. Don't carve your name in it. It's a living, breathing animal. I see people do this all the time on like social media. They'll carve their name into a coral. The functional equivalent of that would be going up to an elephant and carving your name in the side of an elephant. So leave corals alone. They're really important organisms. This is a great YouTube video that talks about how corals work. But just in brief, how corals work. Inside of a coral, they have an organism that's microscopic called the zooxanthellae. It's a very diverse group of microscopic eukaryotes. These microscopic eukaryotes are photosynthetic. And so this coral and its zooxanthellae live in a symbiosis. It's an endosymbiosis because the zooxanthellae is living inside the coral. Now, what ends up happening is the zooxanthellae photosynthesizes, giving food to the coral. And the coral brings in nutrients for the zooxanthellae, so they very much have this crosstalk between them, where we have the photosynthesizer giving food to the coral, which again is a living, breathing animal, and the coral in turn is giving it a house and giving it nutrients it gets from the water. So it is this nice little living, breathing two-organism system. But this is a really important group of organisms. I'm sure you guys have all seen documentaries or you've seen something on the news about how coral reefs have this amazing diversity of fish and life, and they do. Coral reefs are some of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet, but again, it all starts off with the corals and their symbiosis with their zooxanthellae. But again, they're animals, but they do rely on their photosynthetic friend, their zooxanthellae. So that's our corals. Jellyfish are a bit different. But they are actually very similar to corals. You might not think of it, but they're classified in the same group because they have the same body structure. Now, jellies are clearly motile. They're free floating through the water. But what's sort of the weird thing, and I remember learning about this a long time ago, and I'm thinking like, how did they group these together? But when you really look at it, and you really think about it from an evolutionary concept, they actually are very, very similar. They just have gone slightly different routes. And so you can look at the overall form of a jellyfish. You can look at the overall form of a um, of a coral, and you can see they have very similar structures. They have a gastrovascular cavity, and that sort of is propagated through life. They have tentacles. They have the mouth and anus. It's the same opening, which is kind of gross, I guess, if you think about it. But this is what a polyp looks like, and this is what essentially a mature form of it looks like. Now, the idea being is this, in terms of a jellyfish, will directly develop into this. But this is what an early coral looks like. An early coral has a polyp form. But essentially what happens with the coral, it gives up its tentacles, it gives up its motile lifestyle to become sessile. So the idea being is this polyp will land on a hard surface, attach, and then develop into a coral. But again, it started off looking very much like a jellyfish. One other thing I will note is that they do reproduce asexually, so they're making their own sperm and their egg to fertilize and releasing fertilized eggs out there. But they do develop into these polyps, and the polyps either become corals, and if you're a different species, you become a jellyfish. So, that being said, our jellyfish are predatory. Typically, they're eating plankton and microscopic organisms, and again, our corals are relying on their zooxanthellae. Next up is our annelids. These are our worms. These might gross you out or not. It depends on how you feel about worms. But one of the important sort of evolutionary milestones about our annelids relative to our sponges and our corals is the first group of organisms to concentrate neural-like elements in a head-like region. And what do I mean by neural-like elements? I mean they're the first people that developed a brain. And these are just tubes of worms, and we don't like to think of that they have this big brain, and they don't have a big brain, but they were the first organisms to develop a brain. When we're thinking about sort of corals and jellies, they just are cells acting together, sensing the environment around them. There was no nervous tissue. But once the annelids came around, our worms, then we started to develop a brain. And that's an important evolutionary milestone along the way. And in addition, closely related to our annelids are our flatworms, and these are principally thinking there's a groups of them that are marine in origin, but a lot of our flatworms we typically consider to be like parasitic and things like that. So, for instance, our lovely tapeworms fall into this category. But again, very much like our other worms. Our flatworms, they have that concentrated neural element. And just as a note, there is a really wacky group of annelids. They are called, oh my goodness, I can't believe I just dropped the name. My friend would be so disappointed in me. Anyways, there's a special group of these worms. I'm sorry, they're called planaria, and they're these aquatic worms. They live in ponds. And planaria, as you can see, they have their digestive tract here in this sort of pinky color, and then they have their nerve cords, and they have this nervous tissue center. So they have a very primitive brain and a very primitive nervous system. And like our nervous system, it fires electrical impulses that allow them to move. But what you'll notice is they have a mouth and an anus, so they still haven't developed that front and back yet. But what you also notice, they've developed what are called eye spots. And now eye spots are different from eyes. Eye spots just sense the difference between light and dark. So they can only say if it's dark outside or light outside. They can't say, oh, hey, here's an orange. They can just say, hey, it's sunny or it's not sunny. But one of the cool things about these worms, and if you have a few minutes, is actually what's really cool about worms in general is they have a regenerative ability. And what's cool about this worm is you can cut it into like dozens of pieces, and over about a 2-week period, it will actually develop into a brand new worm. And I mean a brand new worm as in like for every piece you cut, a brand new worm will appear. So if you got like 5 or 10 minutes, take a peek at this video. It's a really cool group of organisms that people have been studying for a long time to try to understand how tissue regeneration works and how to apply tissue regeneration to humans. So again, if you have a couple minutes, take a peek at this video. And then finally, we have in terms of our annelids, we have our roundworms, and these are the first organisms to have a completely closed digestive tract. And what do I mean by that? It means they have a mouth and a butt. That's what that means. So, in addition, we have our polychaetes. These are marine worms. We talked about a special type of polychaete in our bacterial talk, where we had essentially a 6-foot long worm that had a symbiosis. That was a polychaete. So polychaetes are marine worms. You might have seen these if you've ever done anything in the ocean. But again, lots of important things here in our worms. Finally had a close mouth. We finally had a separation between mouth and anus. We finally have nervous system tissue. We have cool things like regenerative abilities. And then finally, one of our last important types of annelids is actually our earthworms. And so you all have heard of earthworms before. They are super duper abundant in soil. One of the cool things about earthworms is you can go out to your average everyday forest, and there are per acre, there are tens of thousands of them out there. So they are very important for how ecosystems function. But these are what we call bulk feeders. And so the idea being is these worms, they essentially move their way through soil. They eat the soil, and the soil essentially passes all the way through the digestive tract, and they poop out that soil. And what this does is it aerates soil, which increases decomposition, which increases recycling of nutrients in the soil. So these worms help ecosystems function better. They help plants get more nutrients. They help things decompose. And decomposition, as we talked about, is important because it helps return nutrients back to the system. And one other thing I'd like to point out about earthworms, and the sort of the last cool thing annelids have done for us in terms of evolutionary speaking, is, well, actually two things. One, they're segmented, and I think that's an important thing. They have different parts of them. And the second thing is they're starting to develop organs, right? So they have that front to back anus. They have an actual mouth and an actual anus, very much like we do. But they're also developing organs, specialized tissue. In this case, we're seeing a heart. So that's an important thing. They're developing organs, and we haven't had that thus far. There was no specialized tissue until the annelids. So again, specialized tissue, front to back anus, may not seem like crazy important evolutionary milestones, but they were. They certainly were. Could you imagine having to poop and eat out of the same hole? That'd be gross. That's an important milestone. Next up is our molluscs. And so at this point, we've covered the worms and the worms here, and then our sponges and our cnidaria. Next up is the mollusks, and the mollusks are cool. And there's one of three groups of mollusks, and they typically will be living in shells. But we have, for our three main groups, we have our gastropods, our bivalves, and our cephalopods. And I always thought it was weird that these were grouped together, but they do have a very similar sort of body structure, lifestyle, things like that. And so when we're thinking about our cephalopods, we have the three groups. So we have, we have three groups within cephalopods, which is a subsection of our three groups from our mollusks. And for our cephalopods, we have squids. They have very short tentacles. Sometimes squids will have really long tentacles if you're talking about the giant squids, but typically speaking, your average squid looks like this, very short tentacles. They're free swimming. There's about 300 species out there right now. We have our octopi, which have their 8 long tentacles that are called arms. They live on the bottom. They live in coral reefs. And like our squids, there's about 300 species of them. And then we have our nautilus. There's only about 6 species out there. They're essentially chambered. They have these little tentacles. They are free swimming. They essentially eject water out of their mouth to push them along. Pretty cool looking group of organisms. But one of the things that our cephalopods are really known for is their intelligence. And so if you have time to watch this YouTube video, it's about octopi. And one of the cool things about octopi is they do have a central brain up in that big noodle over here. They have eyes that physically can see in color. That's an important evolutionary milestone, is actual functioning eyes. And this is first evolved in our cephalopods here. But one of the cool things that octopuses do is they're very smart, and they have brains that are scattered throughout each one of their legs. And so their legs have their own brains. So their legs, or their arms, whichever you want to call them, they can act independently. And because they can act independently, they can think and do things in a really fast way. So if you have a couple minutes, take a peek at this video, learn about octopi, learn how wacky and wild they are and how smart they are. The other sort of mollusks that we're not going to talk about, again, are bivalves and gastropods. Bivalves being clams, mussels, and things like that, hard-shelled outer things. Not a really cool group of organisms, but important for aquaculture and human nutrition. And then finally, our gastropods, which are slugs and snails and stuff like that. But I think one of the important things to note about the mollusks is that thus far, basically everything has been water-bound. now we actually finally have something that lives on land. So our gastropods are essentially the first major group of arthropods that we have living on land as a whole. But again, the brain was a big thing. Eyes were a big thing as well. And then finally, well, actually second to last, I should say, the major group of arthropods, I'm sorry, the major group of invertebrates we're going to talk about are the arthropods. And this is the most species diverse group of organisms on the planet. This is where evolution went crazy. This is where evolution saw a design and said, wow, this is really successful, and allowed a lot of modifications to that design. And so the arthropods are the most abundant groups of organisms on the planet outside of our bacteria. They are some of the most important organisms out there. Excuse me. And our arthropods, they're divided into multiple different groups. We have the insects, we have the arachnids, we have the crustaceans. So those are our three major groups. Yeah, so sort of the major groups. And you can see just by looking at this picture, very, very diverse. And you'll notice that one key feature has evolved here, and that is flight. Another key feature that you might not think about is mandibles, is jaws. So let's talk about these groups, this group of organisms. Why are they so successful? How do they do their thing? And what sort of evolutionary things did they bring to the table? So they undergo complete metamorphosis. They develop. So they are laid as eggs, and they develop as they hatch from their eggs as larvae. And so the best way we'll talk about this is a caterpillar. I'm sure you all have seen a caterpillar before, but a caterpillar is just a larval form of a butterfly or a moth, depending on what you want to talk about. But this the egg hatches into a larva, and this larva just goes to town. It starts to eat all the things it can find, and it eats and eats and eats, and it gets big. It gets pretty big, actually. Just as a note, the larval stage of most insects is typically 6 times the weight of the adult stage. So if you have an insect that weighs 5 pounds, its larva would have weighed 30 pounds. So just as a note, there are no insects that weigh 6 pounds, by the way, but just figured I'd make a crazy example out of that. But again, it starts as a larva. It eats and eats and eats, and then it becomes then it switches its life cycle, and it becomes a pupa. And so essentially, it encases itself in a hard thing. It basically dissolves its own entire body and reforms itself into the adult version. So this is the metamorphosis. It's the analogy like if you were an ugly child and then you became pretty as an adult, you underwent a metamorphosis. That's the sort of analogy here. You started off here, you completely changed, and now you're, I guess, potentially more attractive. Though I like the caterpillars. I think they're cool. But this is a thing that's unique to insects. They do this complete metamorphosis. They use a larva and a pupal in adult stage. And one of the things about insects that we typically see as well is the vast majority of insect species are most active when they're larvae, and they're really only adults when they're sort of trying to mate and pass on their genes to the next generation. But this is the complete metamorphosis that they undergo, this full development. And insects have developed, again, insects just being a special group of these arthropods, they have developed a very consistent strategy for how they develop their bodies. And as I mentioned, the worms had segmented bodies. Well, the insects have taken that further. They have this overall tri-structure to them, where they have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. And now I think that should be pretty consistent what you think about in terms of a human body plan. We have a head, we have a torso, and we have essentially an abdomen and a torso fused together, right? We have a very similar structure to them. And this body plan was really successful. In fact, it doesn't matter what insect group you look at. If you look at moths, you look at wasps, you look at damselflies, mosquitoes, beetles, doesn't matter. They all have the same structure: head, thorax, abdomen. And now, this is a very conserved group type of things. They all have antennae, they all have eyes, and again, they have mouth parts, which is an important thing. The development of mandibles to chew your food, to break your food apart, to cut through tough plant fibers. That's what mandibles were for. In addition, you can think about mandibles could be predatory in the case of a wasp, right? Mandibles might be good for chomping through insect parts. So it means you can be a better predator. Um, and they have insects all in common have 6 legs. That's in contrast to arachnids, which have 8 legs. They have a very different body structure. And then finally, insects have wings. Not all of them have wings, but a large proportion of insects have wings. So this is the very first case where flight has evolved. And one last sort of things that insects have developed as arthropods is sight. And so not all insects can see very well, but some that are really, really good at flying, such as damselflies or moths or bees and stuff like that, they have pretty good eyesight. And it's not just the day and night thing. It's very good eyesight, like, not as good as we have, but, pretty good eyesight as a whole. And so overall, that's those are insects. They are, again, the most important group of our arthropods, but that's not the only group of arthropods. But again, insects are the most have only 2 body parts, so they have essentially a thorax that's fused to their head, and they have an abdomen. And so that's in contrast to the 3 body part insect that we just talked about. And so our spiders, again, have 8 legs, 2 body parts. The legs are located on the thorax/head. They have specialized mouth parts, and all spiders are predators. There's no spiders that are feeding on plants or anything like that. And when I say they have specialized mouth parts, the thing that they evolved, and I'm sure you guys all know this, is fangs. So if spiders will bite things. They've also developed some pretty potent venoms. So they bite things with their fangs, and they inject them with venom to kill their prey. The other thing that spiders and other arachnids do is once they've killed their prey, they essentially pump their prey full of digestive enzymes to dissolve them and suck them up like a smoothie. So in case you want it to be even more grossed up by spiders, that's how they feed. And the other thing that spiders have developed is actually is web. And so they make these certain groups of spiders make webs. And as you probably have heard, they're very, very strong material overall. So that is our spiders. Pretty cool group of organisms, at least to me. I know most people hate spiders, but I think they're pretty cool. Next up is our crustaceans, and these are very commercially viable things: lobsters, crabs, things like that. Shrimp fall into this as well. And they typically have multiple pairs of legs. Typically speaking, they have 5 pairs of appendages that sort of hang off their legs. So we're thinking about here. They have a double parted body, and most commonly they're aquatic. And so thinking about this, we have 2 groups of organisms here that are land-bound. Most crustaceans are aquatic in nature. There is one group of crustaceans. They're called they're isopods. They're called, I'm sure you guys have all heard of them, the roly-polies. Those bugs, those are crustaceans. They are land-bound, but most crustaceans are completely aquatic. They've also developed claws, so I'm sure you guys have all seen lobster claws and how strong they are, but this is another sort of unique thing that they've developed is claws. And then finally we have our millipedes and our centipedes, and they're cool. They're kind of worm-like. They have segmented bodies. They either have 1 leg per body segment, like a millipede, or they have multiple legs per body segment to be a centipede. I'm sorry, I got that completely wrong. They have 1 leg per body part, they're a centipede. They have 2 legs per body part, they're a millipede. But they do have long segmented bodies. They are typically, for centipedes, they're typically predatory. For millipedes, they're typically decomposers. They like to eat dead stuff. That being said, our centipedes are voracious predators. So if you ever find a centipede in your house, it's not like dangerous to you, not like a big centipede like this would be, but just to know, you should probably leave it alone because it's really good at killing flies and bed bugs and all sorts of stuff that would cause you problems, including ants and stuff like that. So if you ever see a centipede, just leave him be, especially if he's in your house, because he's doing good work for you, and he's doing it for free. So that's our arthropods. Some really big evolutionary things: mandibles, segmented bodies, much more complex internal bodies that we didn't really get into. But this will lead us to one of our sort of our final group of invertebrates. Again, um, things without spines or skeletons. Because remember, even though insects and crustaceans they're big and they can get pretty large. I mean, the biggest lobsters out there can be 50 plus pounds, so they can be massive. They're still supported by a hard exoskeleton, a hard outer coating on their bodies. And so this next group of organism actually was the first to develop a skeletal system. In particular, this skeleton is called an endoskeleton, and we'll get into what that looks like in just a moment. But the ectoderms are a group of organisms that include sea stars. So I'm sure you guys have all seen this, or if you like SpongeBob, Patrick was an ectoderm. Our urchins and our sand dollars. And so these are our ectoderms. There's not a lot of species of these out there. The most speciose is these two groups. There's only a few species of sand dollars out there. And sort of visually speaking, it would, again, groupings of things together by characteristics is weird, but they are the most closely related to each other, even though they look so different. You know, this looks like a spiky ball. This looks like just a star. This just looks like a rock. But they all are related. They do share one thing in common, and that is their endoskeleton. And so again, thus far, we've been talking about organisms that only have hard outer layers. And this hard outer layers is what supported everything about them. They might have had liquid inside them. Like, so if you ever squish an insect, it's goopy and there's liquid inside. But again, they're all supported by that outer hard skeleton, that ectoskeleton. Now, what our ectoderms have done is they've evolved the capacity for an endoskeleton, an internal skeleton. And you can see that here. So this is just a cross section of a sand dollar. And you can see the sand dollar has a skeleton. It has structures inside supporting it. They're hard structures. And that's sort of the last major sort of thing that we kind of need to have evolved, right? A skeleton. Because clearly we have a skeleton, right? All mammals have a skeleton. All vertebrates have a skeleton. So that was one of the last major evolutionary things we needed. So let's do a quick summary thus far. So we went from just, from one hole to a fully closed digestive system, having a mouth and an anus. We evolved brains. We evolved left and right symmetry, which we saw in the insects and the worms. We have just a primitive skeleton. So we've evolved all these different things. What sort of, I guess the question is being of all the sort of evolutionary adaptations we have talked about, what is missing to make a dog? So if we're going to try to make my dog, Snickers, what are we missing? What evolutionary thing have we not evolved? So if you have any thoughts on this, jump in the chat. Tell me what you think. What things are we missing to make Snickers? And there's no right or wrong answers here. There's lots of things we haven't talked about to make a dog, to make an animal, to make an invertebrate. I'm sorry, a vertebra. Not all at once. So digestive system, that's an interesting thought. Well, we have that, but we have that closed version, but it's certainly not as complex as a dog's digestive system. That's a good thought. What else do we need to make a dog? Based on all the characteristics we've talked about. We talked about a brain, we talked about symmetry, talked about organs and specialized tissues. The key thing is part of it is the skeleton. So in terms of hearing and scent, what makes a dog have a really good sense of smell is the length of their nose. And so dogs have very long nasal cavities, which allows much more smell receptors to be on their nose. And the more smell receptors you have, the better the sense of smell you have. So dogs like hounds that have very, very long noses have many, many more smell receptors on their nose. That's in contrast to a dog like my dog, like a pit bull, that has a very, very short nose, which has very little smell receptors. And that's further in contrast to us. We have very, very short noses, very, very few smell receptors. So we have a very limited sense of smell versus dogs because of how short our noses are. In terms of hearing, that's simply this. That's a function of a couple different things. It's all about your ear, the way your ear is shaped, the size of your drum, and the amount of receptors you have inside your ear. And so they have all sorts of cool things about that as well, much better than we do. So, but again, the big thing is a spine. And as you'll see from our chordates, which are anything with a spine, this can take a really, really different approach. Like a really, really different approach. So while we looked at sort of these really important groups of invertebrates out there, we look at them and say they don't look, I don't know, I think they look cool, but most people just kind of look at them and say they're not that cool. They're not that, they haven't gone crazy. But when you start to look at the chordates, you start to see a group of organisms that kind of have gone a little bit crazy. Evolution has taken a huge leeway with how these organisms evolve. So you can group these organisms together just because they have a spine or not, but you start to see things like fish and how different they are from reptiles and how different they are from primates. And so our chordates are really diverse. And so our chordates are divided into three broad groups. They have the tunicates, which are these filter-feeding marine animals. They're typically attached to rocks. You've seen these before if you've ever gone down to a dock. Their larvae are free swimming, so these are very much like our invertebrates, but they do have an overall skeletal structure. Next up, we have our lancelets. These are filter-feeding marine animals. They have a spine. They live in coastal waters. You probably have never seen one of these before. They embed themselves into the soil of wherever they're living, and they filter feed. Goes through one mouth from the other. Then finally, we have our chordates, which we think about are the vertebrates, and these are the most diverse group. There's not a ton of species of both of these out there, but there is a decent amount of species of vertebrates, and our vertebrates are broken up into a number of different groups of organisms, including lampreys and different types of fish, including cartilaginous fishes, rayed finfish, lobed finfishes, and then finally amphibians, reptiles, and birds, and finally mammals. So these are sort of our major groups of invertebrates, and they have all sorts of cool things that are happening along the way. And so one of the big things that animals have done is they evolve fins as well as jaws. And so we talked about with insects and spiders, we talked about fangs and we talked about mandibles. Those are just for cutting, or those are just for injecting, right? They're not for chewing. And so the development of jaws, not Jaws as in like the cool movie series, but like jaws as in what you have, right? You can physically grab something, use it to tear, and then you can physically use it to macerate it, to chew it up. Now, would you imagine you would get more energy from food if you macerated it before you ate it, or if you just swallowed it whole? And I think the intuitive answer here is that if you mashed it up, you get more energy from it, and that's true. If you mash food up with your jaws, you can get more energy from it because you're breaking apart hard to break down fibers, whether it's tissue or plant. So we don't really think about it, but jaws was kind of a big deal in terms of evolutionary developments, because once you could break down food better, you're not just engulfing things or dissolving them with acid or something like that, you essentially can get more energy from food. And if you can get more energy from your food, it means you can grow bigger. And we talked about the giant squids being pretty large, but most invertebrates are small. They don't get very big. Where our vertebrate animals have gone is they've gotten big. The biggest animal to ever live, the blue whale, is 100 feet long when it's a mature adult. The biggest animal that's ever lived, it has a spine. It has a spine. So you can get bigger if you have jaws. In addition, the evolution of fins was kind of a big deal. Fins were sort of the starting point for limbs, because remember, all life started off in the water. And so fins were the backbone of that. That structure that was evolved for fins that we later tweaked as we moved on to land to become legs and arms and things like that was really successful, because jaws is great, but what you can have by having fins, whether they're something like a ventral fins here, dorsal fins, or a tail, allows you to move, allows you to be more motile. And what it allows you to do is to have directed motility, meaning that you can swim exactly where you want to go. Whereas opposed to if you're relying on the currents of the water, you can only really go where the currents are taking you. So that's kind of a big deal. Those two things, fins, which again allow you to move, but also were the sort of the starting function for limbs when we moved onto land, and jaws, because jaws allow you to macerate your prey, get more energy from it, which means you spend less time hunting. It also means you can get much larger. And so, as with plants, moving from the ocean to the land was a really tough thing to do. So remember, we talked about gravity being a tough thing to do. Plants needed to, they originally started very low to the ground, but once they evolved vascular tissues and wood and things like that, they could grow much larger. Gravity was a problem for land animals too, especially the early ones. And the way they really got around that was one of two ways. If you were an invertebrate, you had a very hard ectoskeleton, which kept gravity from squishing you. But if you're not an invertebrate and you're moving onto land, you need to develop two things. First, you need a vertebra. You need a strong, essentially rock-like vertebra to help keep gravity from crushing you. In addition, you needed to develop some sort of legs, because legs would keep you essentially propped up so that you can hold yourself up and gravity wouldn't push you down to the ground. And so gravity was a big deal for animals as well, moving onto land. But again, you needed that spine, and you also needed legs so you could physically move around. Because on land, clearly there's no swimming, clearly there's no current carrying you around, clearly the wind isn't moving a small fish on land, right? So you needed legs, and you need a strong vertebra to hold you up from gravity. In addition, desiccation or drying out was kind of a big deal. It was less so about the bodies drying out, though that was certainly an issue. But one of the big things that's difficult from living on land is what happens to your eggs? How do your eggs perform once they're laid? And so when we think about what's happening in the water, the eggs are laid in the water and they're in a nice liquid media. Thus, the eggs are not going to dry out. But if you try to lay eggs that are designed to be in the water on land, they would dry out and whatever you had in those eggs would die. And so we had to develop a new way to do this, and this is what we call the amniotic egg. And so you think about bird eggs, you think about reptile eggs, this is an amniotic egg. It's an egg enclosed in a hard outer shell that prevents the egg from drying out, which would kill what's inside. So egg desiccation was a big deal. Body desiccation was also a big deal. But body desiccation is easier to solve because it just simply means getting slightly thicker skin. Thicker skin can prevent you from drying out. Or conversely, if you're an amphibian, you just go back and forth between the water. You just rehydrate your body over time. And then finally is going to be respiration. Breathing is very, very different in air than it is in the water. And there's a lot of reasons this is. Water is, it keeps like surfaces moist. And when surfaces are moist, it's easier for gases to pass through them. And so that's how gills work. Water just kind of passes through the lungs. The gills capture oxygen from the water. And so that's sort of an easy thing, right? You don't have to worry about breathing. You don't have to worry about sucking in things because as you're swimming, right, the water just kind of bakes your gills, right? It cakes your gills, pulling in oxygen into your body. Not the case on land. Land, you physically have to, you're not, even if you're moving, that's not going, gills aren't going to work on land because gills need to be wet. You have to develop a new way to do this. And the way they did this was breathing. They had to develop lung tissue, a specialized tissue for physically and specialized muscles for drawing in air and new organs, lungs, to essentially pull that oxygen out of the air and into your body. Because remember, everything that's an animal requires oxygen. They're all either herbivores or carnivores. So they have to physically eat stuff, which means they need oxygen in their metabolism. So you have to evolve a way to pull oxygen from the air because it is so radically different than living in water. And so actually with that, because there's a lot more that's sort of after this. With this, I'm actually going to stop the lecture here simply because the stuff there's a couple things after, but they require much more sort of in-depth discussion than we have for at this moment. So I'm going to stop class right here.